Lecture 3, FP1103, Chemical Composition of Trees. It's very important to note that wood cells are made of chemicals. Most of you already knew that, but they're made of very specific chemicals. And most of these chemicals come from the photosynthesis that occurs within the leaves. The very first building block that's created is glucose, and glucose is manufactured through the process of photosynthesis. I advise you to read on in the book about photosynthesis. But that glucose molecule, it is just a basic sugar, and it can be turned into many different things. First, glucose is made. Glucose is made through photosynthesis, and then it is bonded through beta bonding, and it makes these long chains. And those long chains of over 10,000 glucose molecules become what's known as cellulose. And cellulose are these long chains. You can read more about cellulose in your book. But what is cellulose? Well, the easiest way to picture what cellulose is to look at cotton, because cotton is primarily cellulose. Those long white fibers are pure cellulose. Looking at paper, white paper is paper that is primarily cellulose. Again, it's made of the glucose molecules that have been bonded through beta bonding and form these long chains. It's important to note that cellulose is the bulk of the secondary wall of the cells inside a tree. So the two things that we see here are things that can eat cellulose. One is a donkey, obviously, and it eats grass, and grass has lots of cellulose in it. And then the other is termites. Termites are able to digest cellulose and break it down. Now, cows can break down cellulose, deer can break down cellulose, lots of other animals can break down cellulose, but we're not one of those animals. So we use cellulose as often as a filler or a bulker. On the far right, we have medicine. In that particular medicine, the active ingredient is very tiny. So small, in fact, that we wouldn't be able to measure it out and take the dose properly if it wasn't for cellulose. So the bulk of pills is manufactured from cellulose from wood. In the center we have light ice cream or low-fat ice cream. And low-fat ice cream doesn't have enough mass to really hold together. And so we add cellulose to it to add bulk and to reduce the calories. And finally we've got Slim Fast on the far left. And Slim Fast is manufactured using wood fiber, and that fiber, when you drink it or ingest it, swells up when it's exposed to water, making you feel full. Now, cellulose comes in as long chains into our body, and when cellulose exits our body, it is still in long chains. So the best way to say what cellulose is, when everybody tells you you should eat fiber, they're actually talking about cellulose, either from trees or from plants. But we're primarily concerned with cellulose and the other chemicals in wood because it helps us manufacture things like lumber. And you can see in this image of a sawmill that we've got a piece of lumber about to fall off of that can. The second part that we have of wood is lignin. Lignin makes up about 15 to 35% of the total volume of a tree. Now, depending on the tree, obviously there is more or less lignin. And what we've got here are the types of lignin found in softwoods and in hardwoods. Now, lignins are big, giant molecules and act as a glue to hold the tree together. So if cellulose is the bulking agent of trees, or the major mass of trees, then lignin is what holds it together and keeps it from falling apart. So what is lignin in that we consume? Well, the best example of what lignin is in is imitation vanilla extract. And imitation vanilla extract has a chemical called vanillin that we get from the pulping process that is identical to the chemical found in real vanilla beans. Now, they're not exactly the same, imitation vanilla and real vanilla extract. That's primarily because imitation vanilla extract does not have the extra components that are extracted when we extract real vanilla beans. Then another part of wood is hemicellulose, and they're polysaccharides that are linear with branches, made of 2 or more sugars, some 5 carbon, some 6 carbon. So what else is in wood? Well, there's extractives like gums, resins, tannins that are in the cell cavity, which make up about 5% of the volume. Now, it's important to note, wood scientists are not very imaginative, and the reason that these are called extractives is because we can actually extract them from wood. The last component is ash, and ash is any mineral matter that won't be consumed when wood is burned. So it's at less than 1% in most cases. What you'll notice if you've ever burned wood is that depending on the species, you will have more or less ash. And we think about that or worry about that because if we're using a fireplace, the ash is what we have to remove in order to make sure that we have enough room to build another fire. The magic mixture. The first plants in the ocean were flexible and tensile. Think of giant kelp. Giant kelp just flows where it goes in the ocean depending on the water currents. But it doesn't have to deal with a lot of the forces that we have in land plants. Land plants have to deal with gravity, wind, and need to be stiff or rigid. And so in order to be that way, land plants developed lignin. And lignin acts like a glue to hold those fibers together so that they can be stiff and rigid. Well, unfortunately, cellulose and lignin are not compatible. They don't like each other and they don't like to hold together. And so they break apart easily when forces are applied to them. Step in hemicellulose, and the hemicellulose ties the 2 components together so no weak fractures occur. So we have 3 components, 2 that are very critical but don't like each other, and then a third component that is there that's kind of like the go-between. And that go-between helps cellulose and lignin work together so that the trees can stand tall. So the deposition of cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin are a very precise procedure. They occur in a particular order so that the trees and the wood can be strong enough to do the things that they need to do. So first off, the cell wall starts out with a thin primary wall. We can see that in Part A of this illustration. Part B, the cell starts to enlarge. It grows in length, grows in diameter. And then in C, the secondary wall starts to form. As that wall forms, it then begins to do D, which is thicken. And the cell wall gets thicker. If you notice, after the cell wall enlarges, or the cell enlarges, it doesn't actually get any larger. And so all of the cell wall structures from the secondary wall actually go towards the inside, making that lumen much smaller. And the cell wall itself, the secondary wall, is made up of crystalline cellulose or microfibrils. And those microfibrils have 2 regions. One is the crystalline region where everything is lined up perfectly, and the second is the amorphous region. The amorphous region is where things are kind of mismatched up and kind of laying on top of each other. That's important because the amorphous region is where water will go in the cell wall. And as the water enters the cell wall in those places, the cell will either get larger or smaller, causing shrinking or swelling in the wood. Here's just another example of those microfibrils. And we can see that they're just bundles, but those bundles break apart in certain areas and create the amorphous regions where the water will settle. If we look at this cell wall, this cell structure, we've got the primary wall where the microfibrils are just laid down in random. Then we have the S1 layer, part of the secondary wall, and they're almost vertical or almost horizontal. And if you look at the S2 layer, they're almost vertical. The S2 layer, since it's the thickest, largest layer, adds the most to the strength of the piece of wood. And therefore, because of that, it's the most important part of the cell structure. If you change the angle of the microfibrils, the strength and the stability of the wood will change greatly. If you look at the breakdown of the chemical composition of the different parts of the secondary cell wall, you will notice that the S1 layer is primarily made up of lignin and hemicellulose, while the secondary layer, or the S2 layer, is made up primarily of cellulose. And that difference is what makes the microfibrils very different from S1 to S2 to S3. Tracheids in wood are very much like very good burritos. They're closed on the ends. And they're closed on the ends to keep excess water from moving too fast and to keep air from moving into the cell. Because if air moves into the cell, then what can occur is it'll block all of the water that would normally move through the cell. And so those ends are closed up, but they have small holes that they share with the adjacent cells to allow water to move through. And those holes are called pits. And pits are just tiny passageways for water to flow. Simple pitting is just a simple hole with a membrane that allows water to move through freely. Bordered pits are pits that have raised bumps or edges to the holes and then also have a pit membrane to the center. And we can see in this electron microscope view of the actual bordered pits, and you can see right here where one has been cut, you can see the edge of the bordered pit, and you can see the edge of the bordered pit on the other cell. And of course all of these donut-like structures are bordered pits. And if we look at this diagram, what you see is on the far left we have a simple pit where it just has a pit membrane, and on the right we have what's known as a half bordered pit where we've got just the flat edges of the pit and then some tapered edges to the outside. And then in the center is a simple bordered pit, and the bordered pit is distinguished because it has the lip-like structures to the outside, but then it has a pit membrane that is known as a margo, and the margo holds together something called a torus. And the torus is basically like a bathtub stopper. If air starts to go into the pit canal or the pit chamber, it will snap shut, stopping the air from moving any farther forward. But once that's occurred, that's called pit aspiration. Once a pit has been aspirated, no more water will ever move through that pit, which causes us a problem when we actually go to dry lumber. If there are a lot of pit aspirations, then we're not going to be able to move the water out of the wood as much as we would like to. In this image you can see from the scanning electron microscope that the margo and torus are very clearly in the center of the pit. And what we can tell is that the margo is very much just a web of fibers that extend from the edge to the center to support the torus. And the torus just looks like a simple circle that is larger than the bordered pit itself. Now, the microfibrils, they don't go through the actual pits. And so what happens is they work their way around those pits in different ways. So it's important to know that it's just not, the microfibrils don't just end there, they actually work their way around. And that's very important because that adds to the stability of the wood. And what we have in this image is we have 4 aspirated pits where you can see that the torus has slammed shut in the pit. And then we've got 2 that are actually free so that water could flow back and forth through those. So in summary, wood is made of three things. One is cellulose, two is lignin, and three is hemicellulose. Chemicals are important in the formation of wood, and their makeup or their mixture makes a difference in what we can utilize the tree for. The function of cells is to support life, both in holding the leaves up and in transporting water from the ground up to the leaves so that photosynthesis can occur. Please remember to take the small test that's found on my courses that goes along with this lecture.